Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of People on the Move. I'm Weston LaBar with Cargomatic, and I'm super excited to have with me today Matt Schrap, CEO of the Harbor Trucking Association. For those of you who don't know, the HTA is the nation's premier drayage association, representing the port truckers hauling the goods in and out of all the nation's seaports, but predominantly fighting the People's Republic of California and many of the many issues that tackle California's drayage industry. We're here today to get his input and advice as to the advanced clean fleet rules that the California Air Resources Board has just adopted and that will go into effect on January 1, and what the partner carriers and really any of our viewers who operate in drayage should be aware of from a compliance standpoint, from a procurement standpoint, as well as from a litigation standpoint at the end. So Matt, thank you for joining me. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? We're dealing with a governmental organization out here in the great state of California that acts like it's the fourth largest economy in the world, doesn't really take into account any sort of the unforeseen consequences when they're formulating and adopting policy, be it regulatory or legislative. And, typically the industries operating here are left to pick up the pieces and trying to figure out how to comply. And, the states, for better or worse, has always looked at the on-road sector, that being the heavy-duty trucking sector, which the state defines, depending on which rule you're talking about. Heavy duty could be as low as 6,500 pounds GVWR, all the way up to 10,000 pounds GVWR, 14,000 pounds GVWR and above. So it can get confusing to see exactly where people fit into the fray. And as you know, Weston, we really try at the HTA to cut through the mustard, to give people a good, solid platform where they can go and learn about these issues, understand some of the challenges with compliance, and of course, get engaged with local officials or just with some of the other folks who are helping to promulgate policy here in the state, both on the California level and in the state, local and statewide level, like the South Coast Air Quality Management District, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. It's no shortage of agencies who are regulating our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into the first part of this. You mentioned the layers, you mentioned the regulation. Let's start with, what is the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule at a very high summary level?
So it's broken up into basically three components. One component's for drayage, which we'll touch on, as that's what's close, near, and dear to my heart.
All of our hearts.
All of our hearts, right, exactly. It moves America, it's just absolutely. Then you have what's called the high priority fleets provision, that is exclusive of drayage to an extent. And we can talk about some of those nuanced details, but just for the 30,000 foot view, again, you have the drayage component, you have the high priority fleets component, and then you have the public fleets component. So you, as a drayage motor carrier, if you're visiting a California seaport or intermodal rail yard that's ran by a Class 1 railroad, you are considered a drayage truck. That's if you come to this facility, these covered facilities, one time a year, you're considered a drayage truck. Now, the high priority fleets definition, while it takes your total fleet size into account to determine exactly where your regulatory compliance thresholds land, you have a metric that the state of California looks at the number 50. So you either have 50 trucks, you make $50 million in revenue and own one truck, or collectively you dispatch or control the movement of 50 trucks collectively. So it's this 50 rule is where the high priority fleets fit into, as that being the threshold for whether or not you need to comply. And then finally, the public and utilities rule, which has different phase-ins, obviously is meant for public agencies or utilities. So for our purposes, is really done the drayage side, but high priority fleets can get mixed into it a little bit, because if you have a fleet that does drayage and you have a fleet that does non-drayage, let's say it's LTL or over the road or local regional delivery, whatever it is, if you are not solely a drayage carrier, they look at your drayage trucks to determine how many trucks you have in your fleet. So you could say have 25 trucks operating in drayage exclusively and 25 trucks operating in some sort of LTL or cross dock operation that don't go into the ports. You would be considered a 50 truck fleet and then would have to meet these phase-in thresholds that the state of California has put forth based upon a 50 truck fleet. Although only the 25 that are covered under the high priority fleets that are non-drayage would actually have to meet those percentage thresholds. And, we can get much more confusing than that, but let's just say the state looks at the total number of vehicles that you have registered, both in drayage and non-drayage service, to determine your exposure under the high priority fleets rule. But keeping it simple, if you're just a drayage carrier, you're only doing drayage work, or you're doing drayage work predominantly, and then those same trucks are doing other work, the standards that you need to look at under the Advanced Clean Fleets rule are for the drayage component only. And that says that as of 1/1/24, you can no longer add in any internal combustion engines. That could be diesel, that could be propane, that could be hydrogen internal combustion, could be natural gas, or any number of other type of fuel sources that utilize internal combustion for its drivetrain fuel. You can no longer enter those vehicles into port service anywhere in California after 1/1/24. You can only add in zero emission equipment. And right now, zero emissions in California means battery electric or fuel cell hydrogen. No internal combustion at all whatsoever. So that starts 1/1/24. If you have trucks leaving the system prior to 1/1/24, you're okay.
Yeah. So just quickly, because that was not confusing at all if you don't know this regulation, right? Actually, I think it was written to be confusing, quite frankly. But let's cut through the mustard, as you were saying. So if you're in drayage, you can't enter the port with a new truck after the 1st of January without it being zero emissions. So if you're trying to get in and out of a port or a rail ramp doing drayage, and you need to add trucks to your fleet, they have to be zero emissions. That's the first component.
After 1/1/24, correct.
After 1/1/24. If you have a multimodal type trucking operation where you're doing different modes of trucking, your drayage fleet, no matter what, has to meet those requirements. And if you have a combined fleet, and the combined fleet could be from multiple companies that a parent company owned and is dispatching those trucks, then you're also subject to that. However, it applies to the drayage trucks without question. And then the other part of the fleet, I guess, is up to a determination with the California Air Resources Board, it sounds like. And then on the other side, if you don't enter ports, but you're operating in California, if you have 50 trucks, you got to do it. And if you got 50 million in revenue, you got to do it. And that's kind of the breakdown is if you're in drayage, this applies to you. And if you're making over 50 million or you have over 50 trucks, it applies to you, period.
Right. Yeah. And the only other caveat is that if you're dispatching collectively 50 trucks that you might not own as a broker, collectively, if it hits 50 or more, then you need to start meeting these phase-in percentages, depending on gross vehicle weight rating and configuration, starting as early as 2025. So drayage is first up on the chopping block, so to speak, whereas you can have trucks in service right now or put trucks into the drayage truck registries until the end of the year. You can put in diesel, natural gas, any internal combustion engine can be put into the system before the end of this year. But as of 1/1/24, no more internal combustion can be added to your fleet into drayage after that date passes.
So compliant truck before the end of the year would be anything with a 2014 model year engine or newer based on what the port's requirements are, correct? So you can have a used truck if it meets the port's requirements and is compliant with the clean truck and bus rule that the state puts out. Very, very well defined. If you do use a used truck, it's important that you understand the useful life provision of SB1, obviously, because you get mandated of 13 years. So let's use that as an example. If you put a 2014 truck in before the end of the year, you can use that truck until 2027. So you're only going to get essentially 3 more years of useful life, 4 more years of useful life out of that truck. Or you could put a brand new truck in and you'll get the full 13 years, which would get you to 2036 essentially, right? And then at the same time, 2035, 2036, right, is kind of that note. But then also with drayage being, short haul in its own right, in many cases, folks don't hit the 800,000 mile threshold, and anything on beyond 13 years, you then have to start reporting your mileage until the mileage component is 800,000 miles, in which case you're supposed to retire the vehicle with a maximum allotment of 18 years, right? So really, there are ways to quickly circumvent and having to adopt the zero emissions phasing in as of January 1, 2024, but you need to understand how long you can use that truck and what the state defined useful life is. Because some folks may have a short-term need to fill gaps because maybe they have a zero emission strategy and they're not worried about it. Other people may be looking at adopting it further down the road. And these are all things from a business standpoint people need to look at, right?
So a couple nuances there. And we have a matrix that the HTA put together that you can share here with your viewers and listeners. We also have it on our website. It's easily downloadable under our industry issues. And it breaks down this matrix of how many years you get on that particular truck. Now, the way the health and safety code is written, because this useful life that you alluded to is actually something that was codified into law prior to the ACF being adopted. It's called Useful Life, Health and Safety Code 43021. And it says you get a minimum of 13 years of engine useful life. So it'd be the engine year that they look at to determine whether or not you have this reporting requirement, or you have your maximum of 18 years, and then they use vehicle miles to determine this 800,000 mile threshold. So the rule says once the truck turns 12 years old, you need to start reporting. So for a 2014 truck, you would need to start reporting in 2026. And at that point in time, if you're over 800,000 miles, you're physically removed from the system by that March 31st of that year that you've reported. If you're under 800,000 miles, then you go for another year until you report again. And if you're under 800,000 miles, then you get another year. So forth until you hit 18 years or 800,000 miles, whichever comes first. Now, with the useful life, one of the contentions of the Advanced Clean Fleets rule is the fact that in drayage, it does not give you full useful life. Because if I put a brand new vehicle into service right now, 2024 truck with a 2023 engine, I am expected to turn that piece of equipment over in 2035. So that is clearly not giving me my full useful life range, and is one of the contentions for the challenges about the loss about the rule not necessarily having legal authority to be enforced because it has several different provisions.
So useful life has been used as the CTA negotiated that with SB1 to become a protection for the trucking industry because CARB and AQMD were trying to force turnover vehicles, some of which were brand new because they didn't meet their standards. Talk a little bit about some of the nuance of the useful life provision, because we've talked about in general 13 years, 800,000 miles, 18 years, but my understanding is in drayage, that's not the interpretation.
Right. The problem becomes that while they require you to begin your reporting once the truck turns 12 years old, you don't get the full useful life run up to the 13 years or 18 years with the newer model year vehicles. Because as you'll see in the matrix, when you look at, let's say, a brand new truck right now, 2024 truck year, 2023 engine year. One thing for most folks who have been around trucks for a while, you'll notice that the engine year is typically 1 year older than your truck year. Just like we buy new model year cars, it's 1 year ahead for the model year, but the engine was actually built in 2023. So they say, you need to start reporting when you turn 12 years old. Well, if I put my brand new 2024 truck in, that means my first reporting requirement wouldn't be until 2036, right? But the rule says that in 2035, all vehicles must be zero emissions that are operating in drayage service. And that's where one of the challenges comes in, and why, one of the reasons why that rule has a complaint against it, is being challenged in both federal and state court, is that it leaves a lot to be desired from a legal standpoint. However, that doesn't give us any certainty that the rule is going to be vacated or there's going to be a stay of enforcement. All we know is what it says on paper right now, which the first date is 1/1/24. You can no longer put any internal combustion engines in. And then starting in 2025, they will look at all trucks that are 12 years or older and require them to start reporting their mileage because they'll turn 12 years old. So that means 2010 trucks, 2011 trucks, and 2012 trucks will all need to start reporting in 2025 because that's when the engines are 13 and the trucks are turning 12. So the reporting requirement is one thing. That's how they determine your useful life. And then the entry restriction cuts off any new vehicles from being put into the system. But as you can see, the way the rule's written now, those newer trucks, even for the past 3-4 model years, are not going to get their full useful life because the state of California says you have to be 100% zero emission drayage trucks in 2035. And that stems from an executive order that Governor Newsom put forth in 2020, the famous N79-20, that basically said all drayage trucks must be zero emissions in 2035. Without any real science behind it. It was just a number that the ports picked initially, then the state picked up on. Now we're stuck with the ACF, which is also requiring 2035 for all zero emissions operation.
Yeah, and we'll get to the legality of a lot of this down the road in this discussion. One of the things that I think is very important is this compliance aspect of it. We've talked a little bit about what you need to do before the end of the year if you want to essentially avoid having to replace trucks sooner with zero emissions. You have to look at your fleet composition before the end of the year and basically forecast out what you think you're going to need for the next 5 to 10 years, depending on when you might feel ready for a transition to zero emissions, should we end up getting there. And we'll, again, come back to that in a little bit. But talk about what's going on in the OEM network, because again, we've got these layered elements of environmental regulation in California. The one thing that's seemed to remain pretty constant is that the operator, the drayage operator, cannot be held completely responsible for the abilities of OEMs to provide compliant vehicles. And I think that's one caveat that finally the state, realized, that you can't hold somebody accountable and require them to use equipment that doesn't exist. So talk a little bit about where the market is, because by the end of the year, many folks are probably looking, if they want to avoid zero emissions in 2024, they have to go purchase a used or new vehicle before the end of the year. I'd like to hear from your perspective. Obviously, you have a vast background, both on the sustainable and conventional side of trucking. You've helped many fleets before your time at HTA transition. You've guided them in this process. What does that process look if you're trying to use a traditional ICE engine to get it grandfathered in? And what's the lead time? And what does that process look like? And then after that, take the zero. I just want to, for our viewers, have them understand where procurement from a zero emission side is, because I think that the zero emissions OEM industry is fascinating, because over the last several years, you went really from mom and pop, inventors trying to figure out how to create a zero emissions truck to all of a sudden now you have very traditional OEMs that have entered the race, and you have all points in between. Talk about first the ICE component and what you would need to do before the end of the year, and then also what the procurement side of zero emissions looks like today.
Sure. And the date we have to think about is 12/31/2023. That date is 11:59 p.m. The state of California expects all vehicles that are going to be in drayage service to be registered into that system by the end of the year. Otherwise, as we have alluded to, 1/1/24, no more internal combustion engines. So at this point in time, if you're evaluating your fleet, you're doing some calculations about engine year. You say, okay, so my engine's this year. I get a minimum of 13 years. How many vehicle miles do I have? Am I going to have a problem when this truck turns 12 and the engine turns 13 that I now need to start reporting, and I'm going to be at 800,000 miles? That truck's going to be removed. You think about some of the volumes that you're going to need to be, moving for customers. Are you going to need additional equipment? Well, you need to start thinking about that right now.
And Matt, just interrupting you for a second. What happens if somebody needs to replace a vehicle? There's an accident, there's a theft, there's a catastrophic event. Do they need to go replace that internal combustion engine truck with a zero emissions truck? How does that work?
The short answer is they are able to replace that truck with an internal combustion engine. So you're not just limited to zero emissions. If the truck catches on fire or is an accident, you go to the Air Resources Board, show them the police report or the insurance report, which demonstrates that the truck is basically unusable and has been destroyed. You can then replace that vehicle, the existing legacy drayage vehicle, with another internal combustion engine, but you'll be subject to that previous truck's useful life. So if you have a 2018 truck that caught on fire or was an accident and you try to replace it with a newer 2020 truck, your useful life is going to be based on the 2018 truck. So there's some challenges there. They did provide a pathway for folks who had trucks that were rendered inoperable because of something that was out of the control of the operator. But besides that, there is actually zero consideration to add internal combustion engines after 1/1/24. That is the only caveat that will allow you to do that if the truck is rendered unusable. So if you want to add in additional equipment, if you want to replace equipment that you know is going to be mileaging out or aging out at a certain point in time, you have to put that internal combustion engine in now, by the end of the year, within the next 30 days or however many days, from that time.
And physically, you don't have to have the truck. You have to have the purchase order and have registered the truck, or do you have to physically have the truck?
For drayage, you need to basically physically have the truck.
So if you haven't ordered it and you haven't taken delivery of it, you're probably going to buy a truck that you can't use unless it's a used truck or you buy a fleet of compliant trucks and you register them in your name. Those are the only ways that basically you can circumvent is you have to purchase a truck that is already in the registry.
This is where some of the challenges with the rule come into play, because after 1/1/24, there's no transfer of ownership. It's basically as soon as you try to sell that truck or someone takes possession of that truck, it's a new event. Even if it's a legacy truck, if you try to sell it to another drayage operator, it's considered a new event and will not be allowed to be registered to that new owner. So the only way you can get a truck in is by the end of this year. And as you said, you go buy a used vehicle, or you get a fleet that has trucks that are compliant that then you put into your name and register them into the system before the end of the year, or you purchase a company that has legacy drayage trucks and you keep that company's name, DOT number, license, and everything, so those trucks can remain in service.
And that was going to be the distinguishing factor. You can buy an existing company and you can keep those trucks in, but you can't buy the physical truck as a vehicle purchase. So essentially the only way that you can do it is through acquisition.
Right. And you can't put those under your company umbrella. You have to keep that
operate separately.
Company. Exactly. Same EIN, same DOT, everything. So, and then it'll expand your total overall footprint for your fleet size, obviously, because they look at common ownership or control. As we kind of talked about earlier with the high priority fleets threshold, you can own 20 different companies. Each of them have 5 trucks each. Well, you're a 100 truck fleet. You're not a 20 truck. You're not a 5 truck fleet with 20 different companies. So
what if you rebrand just quickly? If you're an existing company and you decide, we're no longer going to be Cargomatic. We're now going to be called ABC Trucking. For whatever reason, right? What does that do when you're the same entity? But what you're saying is, you might as well just keep your branding, keep all of the back paperwork. Yeah. Otherwise, you're exposed, I guess is what I'm hearing.
Yes. I mean, you could try to do a DBA, like a fictitious business name with a new name, but the registered owner cannot change. So for marketing purposes, etc. But the truck, as far as DMV and ARB is concerned, that truck ownership cannot change to a new entity, even something that would be a new name with a new DBA or something to that effect. That truck would have to be continually registered to the same company. The only outlier would be as if you're on a lease for over a year and you come off that lease where the lessor is the owner, you're the lessee, and the registered operator, registered owner is the lessor. You can take possession of that truck at the end of that lease, and you can put it into your fleet as the owner of that truck. That's the only provision that would allow some change of ownership, is going from a lessor and lessee to a registered owner type of relationship. That is the only time that would be allowed. Besides that, you'd have to keep everything pretty consistent to make yourself safe, because as soon as you change ownership with the DMV, the ARB and the DMV systems interface, it would just be a matter of time before they would, run an audit or some type of report that would show that there's mismatch between registered owner via DMV and what's been reported into the ARB's website.
And I think that's important too, because I've had with many of the regulations on trucking, how is this going to be policed? Well, I think at ports and rail ramps, it's very easy, because you're in a registry, show up with an RFID tag, and you either get a green light or a red light, and they'll either service you or they won't based on your status in the system. If you show up as non-compliant, or if you just don't show up in the system, they're going to turn you around. So that's the way this will be policed. And just quickly, I want to reiterate, because this is really about the compliance of it all. The advice from the HTA is be registered in the port drayage truck registry before the end of the year, because after that, you are opening yourself up to the potential of not being able to do it because of all these different nuances. And secondarily, the ports have their own registration process and their own requirements, as you talked about the difference between 2010 and 2014 model year engines. So really, to be safe, you should be registered in any place you're going to do business as well, and maintain those credentials, because if you come out of a port drayage truck registry, or if you come out of the California truck registry, you open yourself up to having to buy zero emissions trucks to go back in. Am I hearing this all correctly?
Yeah, better safe than sorry, right, is how it works. The way the rule works is the main function is the statewide system. That if you're in the statewide system, then you can kind of come and go into the local PDTRs as you see fit. But as soon as you try to do something in the statewide system through change of ownership, or by removing trucks, even accidentally removing trucks, you will not be able to put them back into the statewide system, which would prevent you from entering them into the local drayage truck registries. So you have the ability to be flexible within the local registries, not in the statewide registry. And to better safe than sorry, yeah, you'd want to get everything in as much as possibly that you would know that would be operating up there, whether it's the STEP program in Oakland, whether it's the Clean Truck program down in LA Long Beach. You need to be in the statewide system to be eligible for either of those databases. So better safe than sorry, but the main function truly is the statewide system. And to make things just a little bit more confusing for your viewers and listeners, there's another system that you have to register your trucks in that has nothing to do with drayage, has nothing to do with high priority fleets. That's the TRUCRS system, is to report for the drayage trucks. This is for the clean truck check. So the clean truck check is basically the diesel smog check for heavy duty vehicles. Anything over 14,000 pounds must be registered into the clean truck check vehicle information system by the end of this year and pay a $30 fee. And then in 2024, start performing periodic tests in order to receive your registration. So a whole nother rule construct that folks need to comply with before the end of this year. But for the drayage carriers, it's critical that they're in that TRUCRS statewide database and identifying as a drayage truck in that database.
So what you're saying, Matt, is drayage is the TRUCRS system, and then there's a whole new thing for all trucks, which is the clean truck check.
Clean Truck Check, exactly. CTC, and it's the vehicle information system for the Clean Truck Check. We again on the HTA website, we have right under industry issues, carb resources. We have all the links to all the homepage, the reporting page, all the fact sheets. We just did a webinar yesterday with the Air Resources Board on the Clean Truck Check. We'll have that recording and the presentation up behind the member wall within the next couple by the end of the week, so people can review it if they have questions. But yes, this is kind of a challenge, especially for drayage operators. If they don't know, there's no way for them to know, right? So we try to do as many informational things as we possibly can. But if you're not in the system, then you're going to be subject to penalties on the Clean Truck Check side, which may prevent your registration from being issued. But if you're not registered into TRUCRS for your drayage service, you're not doing drayage business with that truck come 1/1/24 at all, period, if it's internal combustion.
So again, know all the places you need to have the vehicle registered and make sure that you maintain that registration through the useful life of the vehicle. Otherwise, you may lose the ability to operate that vehicle in California, specifically in drayage. So let's shift gears a little bit, right? Because there's a lot of different strokes for different folks in the way that they want to approach the ACF. And I think we've talked about what people are doing that are definitely skeptical of the zero emissions approach to things, but there are others that have been trying to make that transition and may look at that as a soft landing strategy moving forward. Is just, hey, it's a regulation. I want to get ahead of it. There's grant money out there. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think the first thing I want to talk about is the procurement process, because if you bought a truck right now, a zero emissions truck, you're not going to get that tomorrow. You're not going to get that next week. It's going to take a little while. So what happens, whether it's before the end of the year and you've went out and procured a zero emissions truck, or if next year you wanted to grow your fleet and you make an order, how does CARB approach that in the sense of what if I can't get access to it? What does the OEM procurement market look like right now?
Depends on the OEM, to be honest with you. So I know that a couple of, at least one is going to be able to deliver a zero emission Class A day cab within probably 90 days, while other OEMs are going to be 12 to 16 months out. Now, the rule allows for what we would call a manufacturer delay provision, but you have to apply for it a year before your truck comes up on useful life. So it's not, you find out about it, you think you're going to get the truck, run into some unforeseen circumstance like a UAW strike, right? And you don't get that truck on that particular date, and you didn't apply for an extension on your older vehicles. The way the rule is written, it's too bad, so sad. Now, there is enforcement discretion that ARB can use if there's things that are completely out of the hands of truck operators and it's the OEM's fault and you get a letter from the OEM describing the issue. In my experience, ARB does exercise enforcement discretion. But on its face, the rule says you need to basically tell the ARB a year ahead of time before your truck is coming up on useful life that you have a zero emission truck on order that may in fact be delayed past a year. So you have to have a crystal ball. Perhaps you just do it just to be on the safe side. If you have trucks that are coming up on useful life, just go in and request the exemption anyways. But you have to show them a bona fide, legally binding sales order. You can't just go and get a sales quote from one of the OEM dealers. They're not going to give you one. First of all, it's very close to the vest. That's why you don't see public pricing out there a lot. I can tell you that the trucks are over $500,000 typically out the door, or pretty darn close to it. So they're expensive. And the OEMs, they want to see an order before they're going to really give you pricing, which means you have financing attached. You possibly have a grant attached to it. And there is money and support out there for this. So especially for the smaller fleet realm. Now, the state jumps around with what they consider a small fleet. At one point, it was 3 or fewer. Just last year, it was 10 or fewer. Now it's 20 or fewer trucks. But 20 or fewer trucks in drayage can get a significant amount of money towards a zero emission platform, that being battery electric.
$436,000 per truck if you up to 20 trucks if you can combine HVIP and the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach Clean Truck Fund grant, correct?
Exactly. It's a lot. It's a lot of money.
And that's what I wanted to talk about next is two things. One, we talked about this offline briefly, but the mechanism for when you no longer qualify for grant subsidizing based on the fact that it's now a requirement. So can you talk a little bit about when you may no longer qualify for these grants because you're no longer looked at as a quote unquote early mover or early adopter? And then also just if you could talk a little bit about the different funding programs that are out there. We don't need a whole dissertation, and people can either join the HTA and reach out to you, or they can do some research online. But if you could just talk about some of the different avenues that they can go after and where they should look.
You touched on the kind of the biggest one that is of relative ease to get access to, and that's called the HVIP program, or the Hybrid Voucher Incentive Program. Ironically, there's not really any hybrids in the system anymore, but it started several years ago, and it really was the place where emerging technology could be placed to get money on the hood. It's not a scrap and replace program. It's a voucher where they basically give you a check, they give it to the dealer, and the dealer then reduces the price of the vehicle out the door for you, not on the front end, but on the back end. So you'll pay full tax, full FET on the total amount of the vehicle, but then that amount will be reduced by potentially significantly
up to $436,000, right?
The maximum award that you can get would be 90% of the total vehicle cost. So you could easily get a grant, especially if you're in that smaller fleet category, out the door at $60,000 to $90,000 out the door, out of pocket for you. Without
the cost of infrastructure, though. But go ahead.
That's the challenge. The challenge becomes where are you going to fuel that vehicle? And there are other folks out there, these trucks as a service providers that are building out. There's a few stations that have already opened here in the Port of Long Beach where they're publicly accessible to an extent. You go and sign up with one of these trucks as a service providers under a subscription where you can go park your passenger car during the day and then bring your truck there overnight to charge, or to come and do what's called opportunity charging, where you're coming up and topping off, so to speak. A lot of challenges with fueling time, a lot of challenges with the OEM's ability to take maximum amount of energy. So there's some nuances and some challenges with the infrastructure. But if we're just talking about the truck, there's a lot of money out there, especially for smaller fleets. And there's a list of eligible vehicles. You will see pretty much every major OEM on there. One that's conspicuously missing is Tesla. They're not on the HVIP list, but you have Nikola, you have Freightliner, you got PACCAR, you have Hyzon, you have BYD, you have Kenworth. The traditional OEMs are on there, as well as some of the newer OEMs like BYD and Nikola, who are on there, which it'll show you exactly how much money you get on a base value. And then drayage gets an enhancement. Small fleet operators get an enhancement. You stack with money that's available from LA Long Beach. And Bob's your uncle, you're close to 90% of that vehicle cost out the door. One caveat, part of these trade-offs that we're in with this transition is taxable income. So you get a $437,000 grant, that's looked at as $437,000 of income when it comes to federal income tax liability. So some trade-offs there. There's other programs that are scrap and replace, that you have to take a truck and to turn in, both under Carl Moyer program, which can also get you potentially up to that 90% amount, depending on how many miles you do. And then there's the Volkswagen Mitigation Fund. Volkswagen had to give all 50 states hundreds of millions of dollars. What California did for the Dieselgate scandal, what California did is they spun that money into different programs, of which one of them is for heavy duty trucks. For zero emission, you get $200,000, but those are both scrap and replace programs. And you touched on something interesting, Weston, which is that compliance eligibility, right? Previously with the diesel rules, you had to show that you're in compliance with the rule before they will give you any type of money. The ACF is no different. The nuance is that in drayage, you're either a drayage truck, you're in, or you're out. Yep. So you can't necessarily have an out of compliance drayage truck in the system in the first place. Now, if you wanted to try to do a scrap and replace, now you run into this, okay, well, my truck is past its useful life. It's not eligible for grants anymore. But if you just want to go for the HVIP and you're a drayage carrier, as long as all your trucks are compliant, which by default they will be because they are removed from the drayage truck registry, the statewide registry, once they exceed their useful life, they're just physically removed from the system. So you're in compliance when you're trying to get like an HVIP voucher, because they're not looking at the scrap and replace to see if that individual vehicle is in fact in compliance, because you're not scrapping it to replace it with a new one. Now, in the high priority fleets category is where you have to show that your entire fleet is compliant, because you have phase-in percentages, as I spoke about before, depending on GVWR and configuration, that your total fleet needs to meet each year. In that sense, you have to demonstrate compliance up front. Then you can use any vehicle in your fleet for grant eligibility, because your entire fleet meets the standards. Whereas drayage, they're just going to look at the individual truck under scrap and replace programs to say, has that truck exceeded its useful life? If not, it should be eligible. If it has exceeded, it's not going to be eligible, and in fact will be physically removed by the ARB from drayage service by that March 31st date of that particular reporting year.
Yeah, lots of things to be aware of throughout the entire process. As you said, there's a lot of different mechanisms to be able to get funding, but they're all nuanced, and understanding them. Either I would suggest reach out to the HTA or the CTA, or even there's a lot of great OEM dealerships that can give you advice through the purchasing process. And then there's third parties like GNA who do, environmental grant writing and other things. So there's a lot of resources out there to be able to help folks that want to go down that rabbit hole. I also think you've said something that's super important, and that's the word compliance. And for folks out there, we get this with shippers a lot. Compliant means eligible to go in and out of the port. Exempt means you don't have to pay a clean truck fee, especially in Southern California. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding for shippers who get CTF fees because they think that all the trucks that are compliant don't have to pay it, as opposed to exempt. But an exempt truck currently is near zero or zero emissions. And moving forward, the only way to address that would be zero emissions, obviously. But a compliant truck is anything 2014 model year or newer, essentially, at this point in time, something that has eligibility to go in and out of the port. I just wanted to call that out. Yeah. And really, the last thing I think that's important to discuss here is what's going on with the California Trucking Association. The California Trucking Association, and Chris Schmoda's not with us today. He's been on these podcasts with both of us before, but they have done a lot of heavy lifting over the last couple of years in the litigation space for the industry. Whether it was AB5, whether it's now the indirect source rule, and here we go, advanced clean fleets. Are we surprised that they made an announcement that they retained legal counsel on this issue? Again, I think lessons learned for folks that felt like the AB5 lawsuit was going to be their saving grace and decided not to comply. Obviously, that did not work out the way many in the industry thought it would. But talk a little bit about the CTA without divulging anything you can't, obviously, Matt, but talk a little bit about what the CTA is undertaking on behalf of the industry. And I also think it's very important for the fleets out there for them to understand how they can support organizations and efforts like the HTA and the CTA through these efforts, because at the end of the day, it's usually a small number of companies who support these legal efforts. And ironically, in this situation, some of those companies are the ones that have just decided to invest in zero emissions vehicles. So I think this is one that's going to be interesting as the CTA is looking for funding.
Absolutely, because you have fleets that are hedging their bets, right, one way or another. They're going and procuring ICE equipment so they can get ahead of the deadline, but they're also looking at advanced technologies, trying to give themselves enough runway to understand some of the operational challenges surrounding a zero emissions drivetrain platform while supplementing that with a internal combustion engine platform. Perfectly acceptable. Under the rule, it's as it's written is absolutely legal, so to speak. As we alluded to, though, as long as those internal combustion trucks are being grandfathered in because they've been registered by the end of this year. So when the development of the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, which has been going on for about 5 years, and I have to say that the partnership between the Harbor Trucking Association and the California Trucking Association has never been stronger. We are in lockstep with so many different policy issues and really are turning into the only voice here in California and really on the West Coast for drayage operators doing business at seaports and intermodal rail yards. HTA is the point of the spear, so to speak. But the California Trucking Association is sort of the 500-pound grizzly bear in California, where they're dropping the lawsuits. They have a large, wide-ranging membership that is touched by ACF in many different ways. And they've taken upon themselves to sue the state of California, not only on AB5, as you alluded to, but also the South Coast Air Quality Management District on the indirect source rule, and now the latest one on the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule. And the assertion is in federal court, where the CTA filed their complaint, I believe, on October 26th, and it more or less said, look, the state of California has overstepped their authority that's been afforded to them by the federal government under the Clean Air Act. That while California has the legal authority to set engine standards, there's a process that they need to go through with the federal government to have that authority stick. And under the Clean Air Act, it's provision, I forget that, I think, let's not even get into code sections at this point in time. But the Clean Air Act says, California, thou shalt follow these processes in order to implement standards that go above and beyond the federal requirements for any motor carrier or any trucking company that's engaged in interstate commerce, or you're going to try to mandate sales of engines only in your state. That's both for light duty and heavy duty vehicles. So on the heavy duty side, the assertion is that they've missed several steps in ACF because ACF itself is creating a de facto engine standard, that being zero emissions as of 1/1/24. You cannot put trucks into service in California unless it's zero emissions, especially in drayage. And so you have an issue where they violated the Clean Air Act provisions. And then that also lays into the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution that says federal rules will be supreme to any local state rules. And the only caveat being that you can get an exemption, basically an exemption from the federal rules by going through the process under the Clean Air Act. So the first assertion is that California didn't do everything they needed to do under the Clean Air Act. Then one of the other assertions is saying that this rule is effectively impacting the routes, rates, and services of motor carriers engaged in interstate commerce, because no matter where you're coming from anywhere in the country, if you want to do drayage in California, you have to meet this standard. And so now it's turned into a federal preemption question, because under the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act of 1996, the F4A, as it's been referred to, says that any state or local political subdivision of a state cannot pass any rule that impacts the routes, rates, or services of motor carriers engaged in interstate commerce. So those are kind of the two.
Like AB5. No, I'm just kidding. Keep going.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So whether or not the preemption argument holds water remains to be seen. But really, the violation of the Clean Air Act, or rather the lack of process adherence under the Clean Air Act, is one very compelling argument. And you couple that with the supremacy clause, as well as the dormant commerce clause that says more or less the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over this stuff. And when the state does not follow the processes under the Clean Air Act, then essentially the rule should be vacated because it's not following the rules that are put forth by the federal government. You also have another lawsuit that the West States Trucking Association has put forth, another partner organization of ours, not as direct as with CTA, but that's challenging some of the CEQA assumptions. That's the California Environmental Quality Act for the ACF, that they also violated that process.
The greenwashing, as you like to say.
Exactly. Their ARB is greenwashing their own rule. It's the most hypocritical thing you could ever possibly imagine. But this agency has been driven by political aspirations, not reality, and not a transformative, realistic pathway. This is about meeting political aspirations. So we'll see how the lawsuits shake out. Again, they can be compelling, but that does not give anybody any reason to rest on the fact that there is a lawsuit that might be successful. Regardless, unless the rule is completely vacated, 1124 is going to stick. And unless there's an injunction put into place for 1124, if you don't have those trucks in before the end of this year, you're not going to be able to add internal combustion engines in after 1124, period. And so we have to think about that while there are lawsuits out there, and you said it earlier, right? You know, AB5, just because there was a lawsuit doesn't mean it was going to go away. It was rejected by the Supreme Court of June 30th of last year. Everyone's still trying to scramble and figuring out how to comply still. There hasn't been any real state enforcement action. This ACF is much more cut and dry, because just as of 1124, you can't add any more internal combustion engines, period. Yep. That is as black and white as it can possibly be. And so from that standpoint, whether or not an injunction gets put into place in 1124 requires the CTA to demonstrate that there's been harm that will, or there will be harm.
Irreparable harm, I believe, is the terminology, meaning you can't undo what's already been done if the law goes into effect.
So we'll see. But again, what we tell people is like, look, the rule is what it is. The one thing you need to start thinking about is looking at the rule and determining if you're going to need additional capacity. You better start planning for that now instead of waiting into 2024 for when the rule may or may not be enjoined and or vacated. You cannot use that as a business strategy. Hope is not a business strategy, right? The rule says what it says now, and that's where people are being encouraged to follow. It's just the unfortunate reality that we exist in here in California.
Yeah. So bringing this in summary before we get to any final thoughts or nuggets of advice at the end. Number one, if you have a truck that's not zero emissions and you want to utilize it beyond the end of this year, it must be registered in the statewide TRUCRS drayage registry, and that's TURCRS, right, Matt? TRUCRS. The state doesn't even know how to spell, but the TRUCRS registry before midnight on 12/31/2023. Otherwise, you will not be able to use it in California's ports or rail ramps. That's number one. Number two is there are ways to get a lot of funding for zero emissions trucks if you want to go down that route. The money is available now. It will be available until it runs out, or the state of California says otherwise. And right now, you can get up to $436,000 for a new zero emissions vehicle through the HVIP combined with the Ports Clean Truck Fund grant. That's probably the best route for most people.
If you have 20 or fewer trucks, that's the only path.
If you have 20 or fewer trucks, correct? And then the third big takeaway is that the CTA is filing a lawsuit to really challenge the legality of the rule in a federal perspective. But like all things that go to court, you really can't bank on that being your solution. And maybe the most important of all of these things is moving forward, you must be very diligent in forecasting. And really, for many fleets, probably should have been doing this throughout the year if they wanted to add trucks, because at this point in time, the only real bet you may have is used trucks that are compliant to get them into the drayage truck registry. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you have everything registered and ready to go. You need to make sure that the trucks you have are compliant, because that's the end of it. There is no change to that unless the CTA is successful with an injunction.
Right. And I will say that even if we're successful on the injunction or even the entire vacating of the entire rule,
it'll be rewritten.
The tide has turned already, and we are headed towards a zero emission transportation future in California and in many other states as well, regardless of what happens with this lawsuit. There will be rewritten, absolutely, and we might not like what it's rewritten again, right? There's no way to say that there's some perfect pathway to get this transition done. There's going to be pain all around, but regardless, with shippers now starting to be a little bit more cognizant of ESG, they're starting to ask questions about sustainability. That is one pressure, market pressure. You also have the state of California requiring companies that do over $1 billion in business in California required to start reporting their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And trucks are on the scope 3 side, this indirect emissions. So there's going to be pressure coming potentially from customers looking for more sustainable solutions that doesn't involve internal combustion or at least diesel. So
already seeing it on the warehousing side. Anybody who has major distribution centers is looking at the indirect source rule and saying, I don't want to be fined for non-compliant trucks, right? I don't want to be fined for my scope 3 emissions. So I'm going to start asking and requiring truckers to use cleaner trucks, maybe not zero emissions, but near zero or different types of trucks that help reduce their carbon footprint.
And one thing that, with the indirect source rule, it does provide some flexibility about what type of fuel platform you can use, because you can use a near zero engine that operates on renewable natural gas. For the ACF, 1124 is no internal combustion at all whatsoever. And so you can have legacy and useful life protection for alternative fuel vehicles. And it may help with the shipper's ESG because you are utilizing a lower carbon intensity fuel. You're using a renewable fuel base that is actually carbon negative when you think about methane emissions. So there's some pathways out there. But as far as the state is concerned, zero emissions is the future. And whatever happens with the lawsuit, again, we're headed in that direction. So, I always do tell people is, maintain some due diligence and some vigilance because look, this is going to happen. Look at those trucks as a service opportunities. Look at the grant opportunities. Start talking to your local fuel utility provider. For those in Southern California, at least SoCal Edison territory, they have a program where they'll help you through the grants. They'll pay for infrastructure improvement up to the pedestal or up to the meter, whatever you prefer. So there's a lot of resources and money out there. You got to be looking at that because this is not going to go away. The rule may be modified, maybe on its face, 1124, no matter what, plan for that date. But look beyond that, not only for your internal combustion purchases, but think about what grant opportunities might be available. Leverage the resources that are out there. Join the HTA if you're not part of it. Pay attention to these great podcasts that Weston has done with so many supply chain actors who are giving great insight into how to survive this freight market that we're in. Drayage is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's never going to be replaced with on-dock rail entirely, right? It's never going to be usurped with robots, probably not in my generation. So we're still going to need trucking companies that are going to do business. We need to know who's left standing once all the dust settles. So, start early, start often. We're happy to help as a resource here, but there's plenty of opportunity out there. Don't miss the boat, so to speak, on some of this incentive stuff.
Now, great bow to put on this. Obviously, a very clear, concise conversation on how you can comply with not just the state's advanced clean fleets rules, but what they mean. And then touched on many of the other rules that are commingled, if you will, with the advanced clean fleets rule from the various regulatory bodies throughout the state of California. Really appreciate you joining us again, Matt. You always help really frame what's going on and talk from a broad perspective about how drayage companies in particular can protect themselves from being forced out of business. And I have to share this statistic because it's almost December, but as of November 1, over 150,000 motor carrier licenses were deactivated with the FMCSA. And there's 57 straight weeks, again, as of November 1, 57 straight weeks where more motor carrier licenses were deactivated than applied for in the United States of America. And I think that tells the story, because it's obviously different than what we saw over the last several years. And these regulations are a big reason why we see that specifically in the state of California, where many shippers have a large amount of volume flowing in and out of the ports here. So, Matt, any final thoughts?
You know, I mean, the West Coast especially is always going to be a critical gateway, but you know, you nailed it, Weston. It's about who's going to really be able to stay in business. And information is power. You have to be able to access that information, see how it's going to impact your fleet, start making decisions about what your next 5 to 10 years is actually going to look like in the regulatory construct of the Air Resources Board or South Coast or the federal government or whatever. Because the rulemaking apparati are not going to let up anytime soon. And with all these motor carriers kind of entering in when the getting was real good in the spot market, now we're seeing all this deactivation. We're seeing brokers going out. It's a challenging marketplace. But if for those who are set up, who are taking the long view, there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. It's difficult, but the only way to really prepare for it is to start preparing now. So again, leverage those resources that are out there. Get in touch with us. Join HTA. We'd love to have ongoing dialogue with anyone out there. And Weston, thank you for being an industry leader and always giving an opportunity for folks to tell their stories and to get people activated with some of the things that they can do to stay in business. Some critical importance, man. We need as many resources and support mechanisms out there as possible. And you're doing a fantastic job of it. So kudos and thank you for the opportunity here to talk about these extremely confusing rules. Happy to continue to confuse anybody offline or online or anywhere. Reach out to us. We're here to help.
No, appreciate it, Matt. The HTA, such a special organization, obviously very near and dear to my heart, and really the face and voice of all of the men and women that are driving in and out of the seaports and moving freight throughout the West Coast. Again, thank you for joining us today, Matt. Thank you for all of your information, your wealth of knowledge. My big takeaway, this is a war of attrition, and you just need to know all the details and facts to protect yourself over not just today and not just January 1, but really over the next decade or more course of time until we are in some sort of utopian zero emissions world. And then who knows what the regulations will look like at that point in time. But thank you, Matt. In my opinion, the best CEO the Harbor Trucking Association's ever had. Thank you for joining us. I'm Weston LaBar, another episode of People on the Move. I hope everybody found a lot of important information that they can take back to protect themselves and make sure they continue to be part of the California drayage community and the fourth largest economy in the world, moving the 40% of the nation's goods in and out of these West Coast seaports. Thank you again for joining us. Signing off, I'm Weston LaBar for Cargomatic, People on the Move.